Imagine this. You are Senator Lucius Vitellius, and it is March of the year 39 after Christ. Your sandals echo against cold marble as you walk through the corridors of the imperial palace on Palatine Hill. The smell hits you first, manure mixed with expensive Arabian incense, an impossible combination that makes your stomach turn. Through the gilded doorway ahead you can hear it, the rhythmic stamping of hooves on mosaic floors, the jingle of golden bells, and worse, the nervous laughter of your fellow senators pretending this is normal. Your hands tremble as you adjust your toga. You have survived 3 emperors, commanded legions in Germania, and negotiated treaties that shaped the empire. But nothing has prepared you for what you are about to witness. Emperor Gaius Caesar, the one they whisper about as Caligula, has summoned the Senate to a formal dinner. The guest of honor is not a foreign dignitary or a triumphant general. It is a horse. Not just any horse, but Incitatus, who will soon be proposed for the consulship of Rome itself. You enter the triclinium, and your breath catches. The dining couches are arranged in traditional fashion, but at the head reclines an animal draped in purple silk, the color reserved for emperors. Golden bowls filled with gilded oats sit before it. Slaves, human slaves who once served patrician families, kneel beside the horse with napkins to catch its drool. The emperor lounges nearby, watching your face with those unsettling, pale eyes that never seem to blink. He is smiling, but it is the smile of a child pulling wings off flies. What you do not yet understand is that this is not madness. This is a weapon, carefully designed to destroy everything you and your colleagues represent. And the horse is just the beginning. Think you know the story of Caligula's horse? The mad emperor who planned to make his favorite steed a consul of Rome? That tale has echoed through 2,000 years as the ultimate symbol of imperial insanity. Here is what they do not teach you. The horse was not a symptom of madness. It was a calculated instrument of terror, a deliberate machine for grinding senatorial dignity into dust. What actually happened in those 4 years of Caligula's reign makes the horse story seem almost quaint by comparison. The legend comes to us primarily from 2 sources. Suetonius, writing his Lives of the 12 Caesars around 121 after Christ, decades after the events, describes Incitatus living in a marble stable with an ivory manger, purple blankets, and a collar of precious stones. The horse allegedly had 18 servants, and guests were invited to dine with it. Dio Cassius, writing even later, adds that Caligula planned to make Incitatus a consul and a priest. These accounts have fueled centuries of storytelling about the mad emperor and his beloved horse. But here is what modern historians often overlook in their rush to diagnose ancient mental illness. Every single detail served a purpose, and that purpose was the systematic humiliation of Rome's ruling class. The stable itself tells the story. Caligula did not build Incitatus a luxurious home out of affection for animals. He forced senators to fund it through special taxation, turning Rome's elite into stable hands for a beast. The marble came from quarries owned by families he had recently destroyed. The ivory was confiscated from the estate of Marcus Silanus, a senator Caligula had driven to suicide. Every golden fitting, every purple cloth, every precious stone collar was paid for, with money stripped from the very men who would be forced to bow before the animal wearing them. The stable was not a gift to a pet. It was a monument to senatorial impotence. But the true genius of the horse strategy revealed itself in the daily operations of government. Caligula began holding formal state meetings where Incitatus was present, positioned on a couch like a human participant. Senators arriving to discuss provincial administration, military appropriations, or judicial appointments would find themselves presenting their cases to a room that included a horse. At first, they thought perhaps the emperor was simply eccentric, that they could ignore the animal and conduct business as usual. They learned otherwise quickly. Senator Aemilius Regulus made that mistake in the summer of 38 after Christ. During a debate about grain supplies from Egypt, he made the error of turning his back on Incitatus while addressing his colleagues. 2 Praetorian guards seized him immediately. Caligula's voice cut through the chamber like a blade. The senator had shown disrespect to a member of the imperial household. Regulus was dragged to the center of the Senate floor and beaten with rods until he could barely stand. His crime was not treason or corruption. His crime was treating a horse like a horse. The lesson spread through Rome's elite like plague. Within weeks, senators were bowing to Incitatus upon entering any room where the animal was present. They addressed it formally. They waited for it to be served food before touching their own plates. They laughed at the emperor's jokes about the horse's opinions on legislative matters. And they did all of this knowing that every moment of degradation was being watched, recorded, and would be remembered by their children and their children's children. The economic dimension of this humiliation was particularly cruel. Maintaining Incitatus in imperial style required enormous expenditure. The horse consumed gilded oats mixed with gold flakes, drank from jeweled goblets, and wore new purple blankets woven with thread of gold for each appearance. Caligula established a special tax on senatorial families specifically to fund these expenses. The richest men in Rome, who owned vast estates and commanded private armies, found themselves sending monthly payments to maintain a stable. The invoices were itemized in deliberately insulting detail: 3,000 sestertii for blankets, 5,000 for golden bridle, 2,000 for the horse's birthday celebration. Some senators attempted subtle resistance. They sent payments late or questioned the accounting. Caligula responded by inviting them to special audiences where they would personally groom Incitatus. Senator Valerius Asiaticus, one of the wealthiest men in Rome, was commanded to spend an entire afternoon brushing the horse's coat while the emperor watched and provided detailed instructions. Use longer strokes. Mind the sensitive areas near the flanks. Express your gratitude for the honor of serving such a magnificent creature. Asiaticus complied, his face burning with shame, knowing that refusing meant death or exile and the destruction of his family. The dining rituals became increasingly elaborate as Caligula refined his system of degradation. Formal banquets where Incitatus was present followed strict protocols. The horse was announced by heralds using the same grandiose titles reserved for foreign kings. Incitatus, beloved of Jupiter, companion to the divine Gaius, proposed consul of Rome. Senators rose from their couches and bowed. They remained standing until the horse was positioned and comfortable. Only then could they recline and begin eating, but never before the emperor had personally fed Incitatus its first portion of gilded oats. These dinners stretched for hours, courses arriving in succession while senators maintained conversations as though nothing unusual was occurring. They discussed philosophy, recited poetry, and debated legal principles, all while a horse chewed loudly at the head of the table and occasionally defecated on the marble floors. Slaves rushed to clean the mess, and the senators pretended not to notice. The absurdity was the point. Caligula was not insane. He was conducting a systematic experiment in how far human dignity could be compressed before it shattered completely. Now that you have witnessed how Caligula weaponized absurdity against Rome's elite, you are beginning to see the patterns hidden in history's shadows. What you are about to discover next reveals the true method behind this madness, systematic terror that makes the horse story seem almost merciful by comparison. If uncovering these buried truths about how power corrupts absolutely resonates with your curiosity about the real human experience behind the legends, subscribing ensures you never miss these deep dives into history's most disturbing revelations. The stories waiting ahead will challenge everything you thought you knew about ancient Rome and the nature of tyranny itself, because what comes next will shatter every remaining assumption about this emperor's sanity. The horse was merely the most visible instrument in Caligula's palace of systematic cruelty. Behind the theatrical absurdity lay a machinery of terror that ground through Roman society with industrial efficiency. The emperor had discovered something profound about human psychology. People could rationalize almost any horror if it was introduced gradually enough, wrapped in ritual, and made to seem like the new normal. What began with a horse in the Senate metastasized into something far darker. The palace itself became a theater of calculated atrocity. Caligula constructed a special gallery overlooking the torture chambers, furnished with comfortable couches and refreshments. He invited senators and their families to watch entertainments, a carefully chosen word that made attendance seem optional. It was not. Those who declined invitations found themselves accused of disrespecting imperial hospitality. Those who attended witnessed horrors specifically designed to break their psychological resistance to imperial authority. Senator Marcus Junius Silanus learned the true nature of these entertainments in the winter of 38 after Christ. His family, one of the oldest and most distinguished in Rome, had maintained studious neutrality toward the young emperor. Caligula interpreted neutrality as insufficient enthusiasm. Silanus received an invitation to attend an evening performance. He arrived with his wife and 2 adult children, expecting perhaps a dramatic recitation or musical performance. Instead, they were shown to a viewing area above the palace dungeons where criminals were held before execution. What Silanus and his family witnessed that night was not justice or even revenge. It was theater crafted specifically for their horror. The prisoners below were not hardened criminals but slaves from Silanus's own household, arrested that morning on fabricated charges of theft. Caligula appeared beside the family, explaining cheerfully that he wanted to give them the honor of watching their own property being corrected. The slaves were tortured methodically, each implement and technique described in clinical detail by the emperor. The psychological refinement was extraordinary. The slaves had been coached to scream Silanus's name, begging their master to save them. Silanus could do nothing but watch, his face frozen in an expression of controlled horror, knowing that any protest would result in his own family suffering the same fate. This was not madness. This was a carefully designed system for destroying any possibility of resistance. After that night, Silanus became one of Caligula's most vocal supporters in the Senate. He praised every imperial decision, volunteered his estates for taxation, and even offered his daughter to the emperor's bed. His spine had been surgically removed without a single wound on his body. The emperor developed other innovations that revealed the calculating mind behind the seeming chaos. He constructed a room entirely lined with polished bronze mirrors, so reflective that victims could watch their own torture from every angle. The psychological impact was devastating. Men who might have maintained dignity through suffering broke completely when forced to witness their own degradation reflected infinitely around them. The mirror room became so effective that Caligula used it for senators he wanted to convert into reliable tools. A single session usually sufficed. The economics of terror formed another layer of the system. Caligula did not simply steal from the wealthy. He made them complicit in their own destruction through baroque financial mechanisms that resembled legitimate transactions. Senators would be summoned to the palace and informed that the emperor required a loan. The amounts were specific, carefully calculated to be just below ruinous. Senator Valerius Asiaticus might be asked for 200,000 sestertii. Senator Domitius Ahenobarbus for 300,000. The loan contracts were written in proper legal form, with interest rates and repayment schedules. The loans were never repaid. Instead, after several months, the senator would be summoned again and informed that the emperor, in his generosity, was forgiving the debt. But there was a condition. A small service was required: attend a certain dinner, vote a certain way, provide testimony against a certain rival. The senator, already compromised by accepting the loan, found himself drawn deeper into complicity. By the time he realized he had become an instrument of the terror apparatus, it was too late. His fingerprints were on too many destructions. His testimony had sent too many innocents to death. He was trapped. The daily routine of imperial cruelty followed a schedule that turned atrocity into bureaucracy. Morning audiences began at dawn. when Caligula held court in the palace vestibule. Petitioners lined up, senators seeking favors, provincial governors reporting on their territories, merchants requesting trade licenses. The emperor would receive them sprawled on a golden couch, often with Incitatus beside him. He made decisions with cheerful randomness. One governor might be praised and promoted. The next, reporting identical information, might be stripped of his position and flogged on the spot. The arbitrariness was intentional. It prevented anyone from developing strategies for survival beyond absolute submission. Afternoon entertainments moved to various locations throughout the palace complex. The gardens hosted what Caligula called philosophical discussions, where senators were required to debate abstract questions while the emperor watched. The debates themselves were meaningless. What mattered was that Caligula would periodically interrupt with corrections, usually delivered with physical punishment. A senator arguing about Stoic virtue might be struck across the face for using the wrong verb tense. Another discussing Epicurean pleasure might be kicked in the ribs for speaking too slowly. The lesson was clear. Your thoughts, your words, even your grammar existed only at imperial sufferance. The accounts from palace staff who survived into the reigns of later emperors provide disturbing details about the atmosphere of those years. They describe an environment where no one made eye contact, where conversations happened in whispers, where everyone walked carefully because sudden movements might be interpreted as aggression or disrespect. The Praetorian Guards, the elite soldiers supposedly protecting the emperor, developed a bitter cynicism that would eventually fuel the conspiracy against Caligula. They watched aristocratic Romans, men who commanded legions and governed provinces, reduced to groveling animals begging for scraps of dignity. One particular innovation reveals the calculating nature of Caligula's system. He established what he called the Collegium of Informants, a formal organization of citizens paid to report suspicious behavior. Membership was open to anyone, slave or free, creating a network of surveillance that penetrated every household in Rome. But here was the genius. Informants were rewarded not with fixed payments but with percentages of the estates of those they accused. This turned Rome into a city of bounty hunters, where anyone with wealth became a target and anyone without wealth became a potential predator. The Collegium destroyed social trust completely. Dinner parties became minefields. Expressing any opinion about the emperor, even positive ones that were insufficiently enthusiastic, could trigger a report. Fathers suspected sons. Wives informed on husbands. Slaves denounced masters. The system fed on itself, generating constant accusations that Caligula would judge in special tribunals. Most accusations were false, but that did not matter. The process itself was the punishment. Being accused meant investigation, which meant interrogation, which often meant torture to extract confession, which led to conviction and confiscation. The cultural breakdown that resulted from this system was total. Roman society, which had prided itself on dignity, virtue, and civic responsibility since the days of the Republic, collapsed into a survival-focused dystopia within months. Senators who had once competed to demonstrate moral superiority now competed to demonstrate the most abject submission. The economic collapse that accompanied this social disintegration was catastrophic. Caligula spent money with the deliberate purpose of emptying the treasury his predecessor Tiberius had carefully filled. In less than a year, he burned through 27 million sesterces, a sum that had taken decades to accumulate. He built a bridge of boats across the Bay of Naples just to ride his horse across it. He commissioned a floating palace that crossed the Mediterranean once and was then abandoned. He threw gold coins to crowds from palace windows, not out of generosity but to watch wealthy citizens scrambling in the dirt alongside beggars. Military consequences followed economic collapse. The legions on the frontiers, unpaid for months, began to waver in their loyalty. Germanic tribes, sensing Roman weakness, increased their raids across the Rhine. In Britannia, plans for conquest were abandoned because no resources could be spared. Provincial governors, unable to collect taxes efficiently while the emperor randomly confiscated revenues, struggled to maintain order. The entire apparatus of Roman power, built over centuries of careful administration, began to crack under the weight of deliberate mismanagement. Yet the most disturbing aspect of this period was how thoroughly the Roman elite adapted to the madness. By the year 40 after Christ, the absurd had become normal. Senators bowing to a horse no longer seemed strange. Watching your slaves tortured for entertainment was just another social obligation. Informing on your friends became prudent self-preservation. The human capacity for normalization proved almost infinite. What could not be endured could be rationalized. What could not be rationalized could be ignored. What could not be ignored could be redefined as necessary. But human tolerance has limits, even when those limits seem impossibly distant. In the private conversations that happened in bedrooms and bathhouses, away from the informants and the guards, a different Rome was emerging. Men who had bent began to dream of standing. Women who had been used as currency began to remember they were human. Soldiers who had watched aristocrats degraded began to question why they were protecting the degrader. The conspiracy that would end Caligula's reign was forming, not from moral outrage or political principle, but from something simpler and more powerful. People who have lost everything, including their dignity, have nothing left to lose. The winter of 40 to 41, after Christ saw Rome transformed into a city of whispered conversations and meaningful glances. Senator Annius Vinicianus, whose family had been destroyed in one of Caligula's confiscation schemes, began quietly reaching out to others who had suffered similar losses. He did not speak of rebellion or assassination. He simply asked questions. How long can this continue? What would happen if the emperor were suddenly gone? Who would take power? The questions themselves were dangerous, but they needed to be asked. Cassius Chaerea, a tribune of the Praetorian Guard, became the conspiracy's unlikely center. Caligula had mocked him repeatedly for having a high-pitched voice, forcing him to use obscene passwords when commanding the watch and making jokes about his manhood in front of other soldiers. Chaerea was not motivated by grand political philosophy. He was motivated by the accumulated humiliation of a proud military man reduced to a punchline. His rage was personal, which made it pure and focused. The conspiracy grew slowly, carefully. Members included senators whose families had been destroyed, equestrians whose businesses had been confiscated, and Praetorian guards who were tired of guarding a monster. They did not seek to restore the Republic or install a better emperor. They simply wanted Caligula dead. The planning took months because everyone involved knew that failure meant not just death, but the complete annihilation of their bloodlines. Caligula's vengeance against the families of conspirators would be imaginative and thorough. The opportunity came on January 24, 41, after Christ during the Palatine Games. Caligula, despite his cruelty or perhaps because of it, loved public spectacles. He attended the theater regularly, surrounded by guards, but also by the crowds he both courted and despised. The conspirators identified a vulnerable moment. The emperor would pass through an underground corridor connecting the theater to the palace, briefly separated from most of his security detail. Chaerea volunteered to strike the first blow. His fellow tribune Cornelius Sabinus would provide backup. As Caligula moved through the narrow passage, surrounded by only a handful of guards who were themselves part of the conspiracy, Chaerea stepped forward. The password challenge that day was one of Caligula's obscene jokes directed at Chaerea. Instead of speaking it, Chaerea drew his sword and drove it through the emperor's jaw. The blow was not immediately fatal. Caligula fell, wounded but alive, and began to scream. What happened next reveals the depth of rage that 4 years of systematic humiliation had generated. The conspirators did not simply kill the emperor. They stabbed him 30 times, continuing long after he was clearly dead. They hacked at his body with a frenzy that shocked even the guards who were not part of the plot. This was not assassination. This was murder as catharsis, violence as liberation. When they finally stopped, Caligula's body was barely recognizable as human. The man who had made a horse a symbol of senatorial degradation died in a puddle of his own blood in a dark corridor, struck down by men he had considered beneath contempt. But the conspiracy did not end with Caligula's death. The plotters found the emperor's wife, Caesonia, and their infant daughter. They killed them both immediately. This was not cruelty for its own sake. This was the practical recognition that any surviving member of Caligula's immediate family could become a rallying point for loyalists. The baby, barely a year old, was smashed against a wall. Caesonia was run through with a sword. The conspiracy wanted no loose ends, no possibilities for revenge, no future claims to power based on blood connection to the dead emperor. The aftermath revealed how completely Caligula had succeeded in breaking Roman political culture. The Senate, freed from the tyrant, did not attempt to restore the Republic. They did not even pause to consider alternatives. Within hours, they had proclaimed Caligula's uncle Claudius as the new emperor. Claudius, who had survived his nephew's reign by playing the fool, stuttering and drooling in court so thoroughly that Caligula considered him harmless. The Senate chose another autocrat because they had forgotten how to imagine any other system. Caligula had trained them too well. The horse Incitatus survived the assassination and lived for several more years in imperial stables. No subsequent emperor attempted to make it a consul. The story became a legend, repeated and embellished over centuries until it transformed into the tale we know today. The mad emperor who loved his horse so much he wanted to make it a senator. This version of the story is safe, even amusing. It allows us to dismiss Caligula as simply insane, an aberration in Roman history who can be explained away with modern psychiatric diagnoses. But the real story is far more disturbing because it reveals something uncomfortable about power and human nature. Caligula was not insane in any clinical sense. He was extraordinarily rational, calculating, and effective at achieving his goals. His goal was not good government or imperial glory. His goal was the complete submission of everyone around him, the transformation of human beings into instruments that existed only to reflect his will. The horse was not a symptom of madness. It was a precision tool for measuring how far dignity could be compressed before it liquefied completely. The trauma of those 4 years shaped Roman imperial politics for generations. Claudius, despite his capable administration, lived in constant paranoia, trusting no one and maintaining elaborate security measures. Nero, who came to power 14 years after Caligula's death, inherited a Senate so thoroughly broken that they enabled his own cruelties without effective resistance. The Praetorian Guard, having discovered they could make and unmake emperors, would spend the next 2 centuries auctioning the throne to the highest bidder. The cultural impact ran even deeper. The Roman elite learned lessons from Caligula's reign that shaped their behavior for centuries. Never resist openly. Never show weakness. Never trust anyone completely. Always assume you are being watched. Always assume your words will be reported. These principles of survival under tyranny became embedded in Roman political culture. They made future tyrannies easier to impose because the population had been pre-trained in submission. You came into this story thinking Caligula's madness was about a horse in the Senate. Now you understand the horse was merely the most visible symbol of systematic terror that nearly destroyed Roman civilization itself. This transformation of perspective, from absurd anecdote to calculated cruelty, is exactly why these hidden histories matter. If this journey through power's darkest manifestations has awakened your appetite for truth beyond the legends, subscribing ensures you will continue accessing these revelations that popular history will not teach. Your understanding of how absolute power corrupts is not just academic. It is essential knowledge for recognizing these patterns wherever they emerge, in any age, under any name. The story of Incitatus the horse endures because it is safe. It lets us believe that tyranny announces itself through obvious madness, that we would recognize it, that we would resist. The truth is more frightening. Tyranny often appears rational, even necessary. It introduces itself gradually, wrapped in ritual and precedent. It transforms the abnormal into the normal through repetition and punishment. It finds the breaking point of human dignity and applies precise pressure until dignity shatters completely. And most frightening of all, it succeeds not because people are weak, but because the human capacity for adaptation is almost limitless. And they accepted it because the alternative was death, and death seemed worse than degradation, until finally it did not. That moment, when death becomes preferable to continued humiliation, is when tyrannies end. But the scars remain for generations, shaping how people think about power, authority, and the price of survival. The most twisted emperor who made his horse a senator was not twisted at all. He was precise, calculated, and terrifyingly effective. The horse was never the point. The horse was always just the mirror, reflecting back to Rome exactly what it had become.